Hello everyone, I'm Vikas Kumar, Director of GemArts. Welcome to GemArts Masala Festival. From the 17th to the 25th of July, Masala Festival brings you a mix and blend of the finest South Asian arts and culture from venues, places and spaces across the Northeast and beyond this year as well. From international collaborations, award-winning poets, new commissions, workshops, talks and incredible music, dance and visual arts spanning traditional and contemporary genres, Masala Festival has something for everyone. I'm delighted to welcome award-winning poet Tishani Doshi, who will be reading from a new book, A God at the Door, and will be in conversation with author and GemArt longtime collaborator, John Challis. I just want to say a special thank you to our partners, Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts, NCLA, and our funders, Arts Council England, and to everyone watching for your support. Thank you. Enjoy the reading and event, and I'll now hand over to John Challis. Thanks. Culture.
Thank you very much, Vikas. Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you for tuning in to what promises to be a really wonderful reading this evening as part of the GemArts Masala Festival. We at NCLA are very thankful to Vikas Kumar and his team at GemArts who have made this evening's reading possible, along with Peter Hebden and Melanie Birch from Newcastle University. My name is John Challis, a poet and research associate at Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts. And over the last few years, I've had the pleasure of working with GemArts to curate a poetry event at each festival. And I'm very pleased to be introducing and speaking in conversation with Tishani Doshi this evening. Before I introduce Tishani, I'd just like to remind you all of the final NCLA event of the season, which takes place on Thursday, 22nd of July at 7 p.m. and will celebrate the culmination of the New Defences of Poetry project, created by the poet and critic David O'Hanlon Alexandra. David will be hosting 3 poets who have written new responses to Shelley's A Defence of Poetry, which is one of the boldest and most profound statements on the power of poetry to act as a social and political force. And he'll be in conversation with Robert Shepherd, Philip Gross, and Olivia McCannon. You can sign up for this event at NCLA's website, which is ncl.ac.uk/NCLA. And the autumn programme of events will be announced towards the end of the summer on that same website. Now back to this evening's event. Due to the time difference in India where Tishani lives, this event has been pre-recorded. Though please do feel free to add comments in the chat function, as it's wonderful to see where everyone is tuning in from and to read your reflections on Tishani's poems. The event will begin with a reading from Tishani lasting around 20 to 25 minutes, which will be followed by a conversation between Tishani and myself about her work and her most recent collection, A God at the Door. Tishani will then end proceedings with a final short reading. Tishani Doshi has been at the forefront of poetry since the publication of her debut collection, Countries of the Body, published by Arc Arts in 2006, which was awarded the Forward Prize for Best First Collection. She was born in Madras, India in 1975, is an award-winning poet and dancer of Welsh-Gujarati descent who has lived in America and London and travelled extensively and written for newspapers such as The Guardian, International Herald Tribune and the Hindu Times. As well as her work as a poet, Tishani has published 2 novels, The Pleasure Seekers in 2010, longlisted for the Orange Prize and shortlisted for the Hindu Fiction Award, and Small Days and Nights in 2019, which was shortlisted for the RSL Ondaatje Prize. Both books are published by Bloomsbury in the UK. Since her debut, Tishani has published 3 further collections of poetry with Bloodaxe books, including Everything Begins Elsewhere in 2012, and The Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods, which was shortlisted for the Ted Hughes Award in 2018. Her latest book, which Tishani will read from this evening, is A God at the Door, a startling and epic collection of poems that explores injustice, anger, parable, memory, myth, and history, often within a single poem. Ideas of resistance are threaded throughout the collection, which challenges power structures within poems that are moving and prayer-like, sharply intellectual and deeply creative. As Jennifer Lee Tsai writes in Dyslexia, This is a powerful and timely collection from an accomplished poet who effortlessly traverses history, space, and time. A God at the Door, which is currently shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Collection, is an illuminating and dazzling collection of poems that bestows power on the powerless, deploys beauty to heal trauma, and enables the voices of the oppressed to be heard with piercing clarity. So please welcome Tishani Doshi.
Thank you so much, John, and lovely to be here with you today. So I'll start with a poem called Tree of Life. A lot of the poems in this book were written last year in various stages of lockdown in different places. And in India, the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, gave India's 1.4 billion citizens 4 hours to go into a complete lockdown at the end of March, which resulted in a huge migration of people, of migrant workers trying to get back to their villages. And I'm sure you would have seen images of this migration. And many of the stories were quite hard and alarming. But this story that I write the poem about was about 7 men who, when they arrived at their village, quarantined in a tree because that was the safest place for them to be before they went to their families. And there was something quite mythic and movie-like about that. So yeah, this is called Tree of Life. And it takes from the Hindustan Times headline, Bengal men self-quarantine on tree to keep others safe. It could be romantic to sleep in a tree with all the sounds of the forest around, insect cacophony, elephants in musk. I have always loved the word rut, a seasonal glut, the opposite of looking through a window to a never-ending view of wives washing dishes in the sink, Simone de Beauvoir's idea of the domestic abyss. But reader, she had silk curtains and chandeliers. She had multiple lovers and appointments with Sartre in the Jardin du Luxembourg. It is dangerous to romanticize anyone's life, especially low to purge the nobility of the poor. So let me not say how much I cried watching Satyajit Ray's Patthar Panchali, especially the part with the kids running through fields of Kash to watch the train of modernity pass. More poignant if you know the director's wife had to pawn her jewels for the film to be made. The goodness of some women, they almost levitate. Like the girl in the film, Child of the Forest, how she picks thorns from her feet like stones from rice. And the crone, how I love the crone, how all this sadness builds like a raga to bring on rain, which the girl rushes into, of course, ripple of water lilies, siege of cranes. How all this joy leads to death. There are no spare rooms, is the point. In the film or real life, there are no spare rooms. So these men who've returned from the city are put in a tree to quarantine, a tree that strangles its hosts as it walks, munificent shade-giving banyan that hurls down roots as trunks, in whose leaves God Krishna is domiciled. Krishna, who talks good game about the temporality of the body while enjoying the bliss of so many pretty bodies, understood the material world as one huge inverted banyan. And as we're here in this reflection, why not enjoy the fruits? Why not leap from branch to branch like a hoopoe, which these men do, I suppose. Their good wives leave supplies at the base, rice and oil, cooking implements. It goes like this for days. The story of 7 men in a tree surviving a 21st century pandemic. Men who say they're pleased not to pass on any bad city virus. And because the news is so full of horrors and counterfeits, can we for once just succumb to the romance before us? Forget that the tree is moving, that one day its phantom limbs will tap against our door. Till then, can't we stand by our windows and stare at all the desolation and sweetness? Can't we adore the convoluted roots of our attachments, how they complete us? My God, how this living is a hymn. And so the next poem is a series of poems I was commissioned to write for Granta. And it was looking at the idea of membranes, starting with the smallest unit of the cell, moving out into self, going out into collective, nation, species, and cosmos. And it was very strange because this was commissioned before we got hit by the coronavirus, when we really started thinking about membranes and boundaries and how we were all connected to each other and what these layers were, in fact, that separated us from each other. So this is one of those small poems, and it's called Species. When it is time, we will herd into the bunker of the earth to join the lost animals. Pig-footed bandicoot, giant sea snail, woolly mammoth. No sound of chainsaws, only the soft swish, swish of dead forests pressing our heads to the lake's floor, a blanket of leaves to make fossils of our femurs and last suppers. In a million years, they will find and restore us to jungles of kapok. Their children will rally to stare at ancestors, Neanderthals in caves with paintings of the new period. Papa Homo erectus, forever squatting over the thrill of fire, their bastard offspring with prairie-sized mandibles stuttering over the beginnings of speech. And finally us, diminutive species of Homo, not so wise, with our weak necks and robo-lovers, our cobalt speckled lungs. Will it be for them as it was for us? Impossible to imagine oceans where there are now mountains. Will they recognize their own story in the feather-tailed dinosaur stepping out of a wave of extinction to tread over blooms of algae, never once thinking about asteroids or microbial stew? If we could communicate, would we admit that intergalactic colonization was never a sound plan? We should have learned from the grass, humble in its abundance, offering food and shelter wherever it spread. Instead, we spent our feet like this, at life we made, imagining all of it to be ours. A lot of the poems in this book are responses to news items, and it's a strange thing for a poem's direction to work in this opposite direction from the out in, but that's how I've been doing. And I think there's something very difficult about the language of the news, particularly with 24/7 cycles, where there's a kind of deadening and desensitizing. And I think that when we're sort of bombarded with horror upon horror, it takes the language of poetry to sort of examine, I suppose, an event among other events, or to try and salvage something about it that that you can respond to humanly. And so this is a poem that I wrote, which also happened last year, also during this pandemic. And it was a maternity shooting in Kabul. And it was one of those things where you think we're already dealing with climate change, we're already dealing with wars and famine, and we're already dealing with, this virus. And then on top of that, can you imagine a place of birth, which you would imagine would be sacrosanct in some way, being invaded, and how do we respond? So this is a poem that is an attempt to respond, and it is called After a Shooting in a Maternity Clinic in Kabul. No one forgets there's a war going on, but there are moments you could be forgiven for believing the city is still an orchard, a place where you could make a thing grow. There's always a pile of rubble from which some desperate person struggles to rise, while another person wraps a shawl around their shoulders and roasts marshmallows over a fire. This is not that. This is not bomb dropping from sky, human shield, hostages in a stream, child picking up toy that explodes in her hands, although there's always that. Hope is a booby trap. This is the house you were brought to after crossing a river, leaving the mountains and burnt fields behind. A place of safety where you could be alone with your own startling power. Not why were you out, and why wasn't your face covered, and who told you to climb into that rickshaw. But here, prepare for this most ordinary thing, a birth. And this is not to ask what it means to never see someone again, but to ask what it means not to make it past the first checkpoint of your mother's gates. Never mind all the wild places outside, the mud brick villages, the valleys and harvests and glasses of green tea, or even to say, I am here to claim the child of Soraya, because you know this to be impossible. Even if you could bring a man to recover your sister's corpse and the newborn, where do you go from here? You still have to consider the bodies, the bullet-ridden walls, still have to find the small window of this house and take in the panorama. See, it is raining outside, and men weep for their wives, and perhaps the entire world is an orchard that has detonated its crimson fruits, its pomegranates and poppies and tart mulberries to wash these floors red. And those of us who stand outside this house know that nothing will flourish here again. Like crowds who gather for an execution, we can only ask, what does it mean to be born in a graveyard, to enter the world saying, "O thief, O life"? I wrote a lot of shape poems in this book. And partly it's because I think I spend most of my time in India, and I feel I'm surrounded by a lot of geometry here. While regular life is quite chaos, I think we see a lot of impact of shapes and geometries in our architecture and our household objects. And so I've been thinking a lot about shapes and experimenting with the idea of sonic and iconic. So the idea of how sound and visual work together. So this next poem is one of those shape poems, and it's called Advice for Pliny the Elder, Big Daddy of Mansplainers. Pliny was quite an amazing man in that he had this encyclopedia full of information, travels, and he was an extremely well-read man, but he also had some strange ideas about menstruation that I think it's fair to judge him for these many thousand years later. And so he believed it was absolute, like a menstruating woman was absolutely harmful and could scorch fields and things like that. So this is a kind of rejoinder, and it's playful, and it's also shaped as a menstrual cup. So I'll just show it to you there, and I'll read the poem. Advice for Pliny the Elder, Big Daddy of Mansplainers. Great man, now that you are dead, allow me to squeeze your hand. The sage bushes in Umbria are heavy with bees, so I'm killing them with hypnosis. I'm a mere woman, inferior lettuce, but I understand swoon, aka mirabilia. I fill this cup with nectar and offer it to soothe your Vesuvian wounds. I share your love of baths and classification. And sure, if we had to point to a god in the sky, why not call him Thunderbolt? I too believe sewers are the great architectural invention. I do all my searching on roads. It has been 2000 years, so we can forgive some of your assertions. The sea mouse who helps whales find their way by parting the brows above their eyes, the one-eyed humans in skypods with umbrella feet, the whole exotic bestiary. If I had no mouth, but could live off the smell of apples, I'd move to Kashmir. Scratch that, maybe Sussex. Once a month when the blood comes, I go out to lie in whatever field I find, to feel the scorch rise and the crops wither. Our powers are much depleted. I can stand among men in full swing of my menstruous, and nothing will dim their ability to tell me about me. There are birds at the window this morning I can't name, and dogs in the valley beyond who are using their bell-shaped lungs to announce their happiness again and again and again. Nothing has changed. We worry about the wane and winnow. In your time, perhaps the ladies used bits of cut-up smocks, but these days we have menstrual cups. Desire is still a kind of ruin, that silly bird fluttering against the window net, trying to get in, the body's steady lilt towards oblivion. They say you had a sister like Shakespeare's, mostly overlooked, that it was she who first noticed the smoky clouds which sent you on your way. Dear Pliny, I guess you never heard the one about curiosity. The cat is real. The earth never tires of giving birth. If you get too close to a volcano, you should know it may erupt. I'll read one more poem. Yeah? Okay. This one was commissioned by the Hay Festival. And it was really a wonderful project because it put me in touch with the history that I was frankly unaware of the extent of it. And it was to write a poem to mark Armistice Day, the centenary year of Armistice Day. And we had to respond, countries whose soldiers went to war, we had to respond to a poem. And I hadn't realized then that over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the Great War, because it's a history that we aren't necessarily taught in India with great detail. It's kind of fluffed over and quickly get to the War of Independence. Because I think there are so many emotions attached to that. And I found it hard to find poets that I could respond to, unlike the Secret Sassoons or the Wilfred Owens who were in the trenches. The men who went from India were not necessarily, writers, not necessarily even educated. And so I would have to rely then on the Tagores or the Sarojini Naidus, the poets who were writing at home, imagining the war, and that felt too distant. And so instead I went to letters collected by David Omaisa in his book. And I found these letters to be extremely moving because they were written from all parts, from England, from France, and written home. And I wrote I wrote a poem using parts of these letters. And I hope it commemorates their memory in some way. So this uses an extract from a letter written by Kala Khan to Iltaf Hussain on the 27th of December, 1917. What more am I to say? Our kind-hearted Sarkar has done everything possible for us to protect us from the cold. We are each provided with 2 pairs of strong, expensive boots. We have whale oil to rub in our feet, and for food, we are provided with live Spanish sheep. In short, the Sarkar has accumulated many good and wonderful things for our use. Many good and wonderful things. History too has a hard time remembering the black waters they crossed, the small mountain villages emptied of men. Death was different then. History is always reinventing itself. Say what you will, but clouds have remained more or less the same, and leaving home is still leaving home, whether it's on a jet plane or climbing the steep path behind the house with a roll of bedding on your back. But to die in a faraway place whose name you can't pronounce, for a king who isn't really yours, is a sadness history still hasn't figured out. History has been pushing for republics since Lucius Junius Brutus, but men are hardy as the point or bull-headed, and you'd think the glories of lice making mansions in your shirt was a paradise they could do without. The trench living would make them walk across the front with arms held high, saying, "Take me quick, I wish only to enter the realms of God." History tries not to be sentimental, although letters give things away. One fool longed for a flute. The world is burning, but he wants to play. Others were gluttons, mercenaries, spies. The wise asked for opium, but right sweets or dainties, they said, otherwise the package might not reach. History needs to forget the dead who cover the earth like heaps of stones, who write, "Mother, is my parrot still alive? Mother, do not go wandering madly." Sometimes it feels as though the rain has been falling all your life and the girl you married will tire of tending the cattle. Do not worry. This is war, where the women, like metaphors, remain steadfast and beautiful. In history's version, she sits under the peepal tree with your Victoria Cross pinned to her sari. She has been waiting since 1918 and she is waiting still. So let us speak about love the way we always have, by asking, "Have you eaten, darling? And what price did you get for the goats? And of course I miss you, but the earth is hard and the sky distant. And if I had wings, I'd fly to you." In Marseille, they said we looked like kings. History cannot really say what happens to men at war. So listen, at night, I feed on stars. Do not ask about the cold. They have given me whale oil for my feet. And someone told me, if I carried a piece of raw onion into battle, the bullets would not find me.
Thank you, Tishani. Wow, that was an incredible, wonderful reading. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm really glad that you read that final poem, which I have a question about later. And there's so many wonderful lines in that poem. I was just thinking about some of them. History needs to forget the dead, and lines like that, and the line about history trying not to be sentimental, though the letters give things away. And there's just so many quotable, wonderful takeaways from every poem in this book. But the first question, I thought we'd just start at the beginning really and think about the book and how it was written in a way. And I was fascinated by, when I was reading it, how formally and tonally varied it is. You know, we have outrage and irony, solidarity and warnings, personal reflections, prophecy, and it all feels very urgent. And, you know, a poem is at once discussing, terror, but also the beauty in this. And I was wondering if you could just talk us through the experience of writing the book, and if there was anything in particular that sparked its beginning.
Thanks, John. Actually, I work haphazardly, and so I always loved the idea of a coherent collection, something with an overarching theme. And I find that quite hard to do. I find I write poems individually and they accumulate over time, and then I have a bunch, and then I think, oh, maybe they belong together. A lot of this book was written last year, and I think that's perhaps why there's that sense of urgency, because there were a lot of these response poems. But I had been writing, for a few years before as well. And I think that sort of sense of what your obsessions are sometimes only reveal themselves after you've reached a certain mass of poems, for me at least, and suddenly you're looking at it and thinking, okay, there's a lot about the idea of pilgrimage and divinity and what we might consider holy in these kind of unholy times, and so examining those ideas and perhaps once you pick on certain strands, of course, environmental concerns of the body, which have been always concerns of mine. I've always been thinking about these things, but they kind of move in different ways. And then you realize that all these things come together, and really there's no sense of one spark or one great idea or moment. The only great moment is when you realize, I think I have a book. And I love that, as opposed to a novel, which that never happens. You're sort of slogging away and you're working with a sustained narrative. In poetry, there's this wonderful freedom to work just on the poem at hand. And there's also this wonderful sense of accomplishment when you finish the said poem, because it stands by itself and it doesn't really need to have the other poems. It's just that when you do finish the book, or when you do come close to thinking about publishing, I sort of think about it as belonging, trees belonging in the same forest, that these belong together in some way. And you're right, there are lots of different registers. Partly, I think that's because there's lots of registers within me, and I feel like I can't always be hitting the same note, and I'm very interested in juxtapositions, and sort of it's important for me to have a sense of irreverence, to have even a sense of humor, and to retain a sense of beauty and joy, even while looking at something that is quite difficult. And so I think that's what I want. That's how I want the poems to work, in that sense, to be able to hold all these different facets.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. And I love what you said about, poems being trees that belong in the same forest. It's a wonderful way of thinking about it. And going back to sort of that sense of movement, I mean, there's movement in the poems. There's lots of the body and the environment, but also scale. There's that wonderful line in the poem about the dress being like a field, and it says a dress is a forest of memory. And there are other points in the collection where, I feel like we're going from macro to micro very quickly. And I had a question about sort of the body, really, and the role of the body and movement in your work, and going back to your work as a dancer as well. And, is writing as a physical activity, is this a sort of yet another way to sort of physically be in the world and connect with the world? For instance, your first poem in the book, Mandala, we go from the pandemic to the body to the environment, and you have that wonderful line that says, we talk of bodies as though we could not understand the universe within them, even though we've all gaped at the stump of a tree and understood that time moves outwards in a circle. And it's just wonderful how, that the image continues to open up and moves, I suppose, and takes, us as a reader, it really takes us somewhere. So I wondered, is there a connection for you between when you're writing a poem? Does it feel like a physical thing, and do you feel like the poem itself needs to contain movement, or leaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I don't know that I think of it as being physical, but it does involve the body and it comes from within the body. And I think all of the things that I employ or deploy in poetry are things that I learned as a dancer and sort of understood better as a dancer and then moved it into poetry. So question of rhythm and a question of timing, how when you are working with dance, especially the kind of dance I did where we would have rehearsals in silence and the music came later, it was Hindustani classical. So we were not dancing to a beat. We kept our own internal beat. And the musicians came only when we were performing. They had their own. So it was more this sort of two conversations happening with the music and the movement. It was not like da da da, you move your legs, da da da, And so that sense of being in the world where you hold your own and you have all these other things around you, and how do you then converse or dialogue with them is very natural to me because of dance. And I think one image which really, really I hold very dear to me is the idea of I remember seeing this Rajasthani scroll of the cosmic man, what they call Loka Purusha. And it's a 17th century scroll of a person, and inside that person is the entire universe. It's and so in Jain ideology and iconography, this was very and I think there are Western equivalents, maybe Da Vinci's man, that sense that there is energy in us with which we can then connect to the outward, to the cosmos even. And that we are so small and so insignificant as humans, and yet our bodies are filled with the same percentage of water that there is on the planet, and we are made up of dead stars, and we are made up, our very cells, our breath is everything that has already been here. And so we are part of some kind of eternity. And if we think of our physical bodies within a time space like that, it kind of is mind-boggling, and I think that we take our bodies for granted and we just sort of move around in them. And part of my sort of investigations in poetry and dance is to sort of really try to look at the beauty in the body and how amazing it is, and how little we know about it, and how can we harness some of this these energy centers and this power in the body, at the same time admitting that the body is continuously failing us and that we're moving steadily towards a kind of extinction, which is also something that we have right from the beginning. So I think that for me, that is central, that sense of celebration of body, and at the same time acknowledging the limits of and what the body cannot do. And so I think that comes through somehow in the poems, this sense of how body is the microcosm through which we then stride out into the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was just, as you were speaking, looking at your poem, your very beautiful elegy that you've got variations on Hippo, and it begins with this line: every summer I vow to find a way back into my body. And in the poems, you're speaking about how the poems are a sort of a way to locate the body, but also there's this great imaginative kind of thread throughout it, which I guess is another kind of body, the body of the mind, or the body of ideas. And in your book also, there's lots of like parables, I suppose. And there's one poem I found incredibly moving, in particular, called "I Found a Village, and in it were all our missing women." And it seemed to have everything going on. It is dramatic, but is also incredibly political and poignant. And you kind of use this sort of parable in several poems in the wonderful the micro and the macroeconomics duo of poems. And this, it seems to be like another layer of the book, really, the way you use sort of parables and storytelling and folk tales. And I wonder if that's a way of unmasking the world, or speaking truth within the kind of guise of a kind of imaginative world. I was wondering, you know, because obviously this has a history of writers using this to evade censors, or to make things more understandable or relatable. And I was wondering, for yourself, is there a particular reason that you use parable or explore this, or is it you know, part of your imaginative process as a writer?
I think it's to do with the idea of recovery. So how to recover, how to reclaim. When you talk about, I mean, this past year, I would say that we've had such a disembodied experience. Normally, we would be in a room sharing the poems. It's a very different experience to receive poems when we're all in a room with our bodies. And now I am in a room with my body, you are in a room, and people listening are in their rooms. And that thing of catching up with one's body or feeling outside of oneself is something that we feel in any case, but I think has been exacerbated over the last year. And it also leads to a kind of loneliness. So the separateness that we are, you know, unable to have that sense of full potential, you know. And in terms of using the idea of folk or parable, or even storytelling, or some kind of myth making, I think, you know, I do love stories, and India is a very a place that relies very much on an oral tradition of storytelling. I'm also hesitant because I think poetry is in a different realm, you know, where narrative is sort of secondary to, say, something like revelation or praise or the moment or something that's not so easily pin downable. But there is something about myth making in the poem that can be done very quickly, and there's something quite grand about that gesture. And so that poem that you were talking about, the you know, I found a village and in it were all our missing women. I mean, this question of disappeared women in India has been something I've been writing about for a long time. And this story is not about women who have been killed or, you know, all of that, but it is women who have been disappeared from the electoral register. So 21 million, which is the size of Sri Lanka, basically, just can't vote because for some reason there has been this mess up, and despite everything they've done, they've not been given that right to vote. And so they've just been, that's like a kind of vanishing as well. And so to write I don't know how that image appeared, and I just thought, what is 21 million? I can't even imagine the size of that, you know. And so I had an image of just stumbling across them as if they were all hanging out in this one place, you know, in this limbo, waiting for the registrar to kind of acknowledge their existence. And meanwhile, they're just going on here. And so that's how that poem began. And I think sometimes why that sense of parable or story may come through is because images is very important. The idea of the image, which based on which you then kind of take off, you know, and then you can soar and move into other things which are sort of maybe more metaphorical or more dreamlike. But I think that original image is, once you find it, then it gives you like a trampoline effect, you know, to leap into the rest of the world.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And I think it, you know, it can kind of become a very political and powerful tool as well, because you highlight the issues so strongly in that poem that you about the disappeared women of the electoral register. And as a reader, I feel like I understand it in a way that and empathize and you know, think about it in a way that I would never have if I just encountered the news story. And I suppose that's the other thing, you know, you touched about this in your reading when you were reading the poem after a shooting in the maternity clinic in Kabul, you know, the power of news stories in here and how that's kind of influenced and led to many of the new poems. And yeah, and I'm sort of interested in the influence of the media, politics, news, these structures of language. And you have another poem, Instructions for Surviving a Genocide, and that poem seems, you know, it's laden with an awareness of the way language is used in terms of propaganda, And I find that very interesting. The poet, the book is so knowing. It's kind of deploying again these two tones. It's knowing. It's being ironic. It's being humorous, but then it's being very serious as well, and very spiritual at the same time. And I find that all those things building together make such a convincing read. So yeah, the news stories. Is this something that you feel is becoming a new thing you want to do more of, or is this just a one-off for this book, do you think?
I think the first poem that I remember, which was definitely a response to news, was Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods, which was written 6 months after Jyoti Singh was raped on that bus in Delhi. And that changed our entire conversation about rape and sexual violence, gender violence in India and around the world. And I found that there was the thing about the news is that because of the relentlessness of it, it erodes whatever was alive in that person. So it's like a double killing, after already a horrible, horrible killing. There's this other killing where the only thing in the memory is that this is a dead girl, and I have a poem in the other collection, Everybody Loves a Dead Girl. And this sense of our talking about it, because there's something like we can't not talk about it, because we feel like we want to speak about it. Even that is, again, a further, and so then what do we do? How do we use language to restore some kind of dignity, or I would say to remember and even to honor, and I think that poetry, we can rely upon poetry to give us that language, or to give us that point of entry into which we can look at this thing in a different way. So I think it's funny, I moved out of the city nearly 10 years ago now, and I don't own a television. And all of this was because I thought there was too much noise, and I wanted to get away from the noise, and I wanted to just be in a quieter kind of space. And strangely, ever since I moved away from the city, and ever since all of this moving away from noise, and I don't get a daily newspaper, I feel like that news is washing up on my shore, whether or not I like it, through some way or the other. And so there's no running away from it. And then I thought, well, I can't run away, so let me just look at it, let me confront it, and let me try to hold it. And the only way that I know how to do that is through poetry, and is through some kind of response. So I think that's not going to go away anytime soon, because I feel that unless we change the way that the news works, this thing is still going to be there, where I feel, we need to create and to preserve this other language, which is sort of working with more honor than, say, and this is not to say that like a lot of the stories that I responded to, the journalism was excellent and beautifully done, especially the Kabul story, which was a New York Times story. It was heartbreaking. And so it was not that language was deadening, or that I'm talking about the repetition of the news by TV channels and things like that, and then those ramifications. But it is also just to sort of go into a place of the imagination, I suppose, which is something that journalism can't do, and to somehow move out of just that incident, And so from that poem, we move out into a panorama. We go out into what's around. We go out of that maternity clinic. That's the image, And I feel like poems are so tiny. They are so small, but they have the possibility to work with such incredible scale. And that, to me, I find really empowering. And it is a kind of empowering thing to be able to write a poem like that, which is playing with these themes that can place the small and the large together, and create these images, create something that is other than what is the story.
Yes, I very much agree, and it's something that I was thinking when you were reading Many Good and Wonderful Things as well, in the sense that, you know, with a poem you can challenge the record as it's repeated and presented in a sort of dehumanizing language by bringing the letters in of these people. And you know, you had that wonderful line about history tries not to be sentimental, although letters give things away, and that seems to be, you know, what the poem can do. It creates space, I suppose, to add another layer, another texture, and so many of your poems, you know, do that in such a wonderful way. And I was interested in how you engage with, you know, history really, as history is this sort of ever-changing thing. As you know, you're saying the poem Bacterium, most of what we understand about the past is written on the skins of dead animals, and we know so little. And that, you know, feeling like a very poignant thing, you know, this very, you know, archaic, very old-fashioned, a terrible thing to do, really, to kill an animal in order to record something, to record our history being, you know, recorded through destruction. And a poem, I suppose, do you, I mean, there's so much about, there's also birth and rootedness in this collection, and is a poem then the opportunity to sort of, you know, to turn things towards the more positive as well? You know, you speak in the last poem about it is not always a war between celebration and lament. And so I suppose for sort of a final question really is the poem the space for this kind of reconciliation, this understanding, this panorama, as you say? I love that idea.
Yeah, I think, you know, poems, they, when it comes to history, it's really interesting because we are taught certain histories depending on where we grow up and depending on the time frame. And I think what we all know now is that history very much depends on who's telling this, who is the, you know, the conqueror, and who is telling the story. And at least there is always this sort of push to reinvent things or to retell history. And often it's a wrong retelling. So, you know, that's happening in India now, where textbooks are being rewritten and just like taking out things that are inconvenient. And this is really worrying because it's trying to present an idea of nation, which is sort of more singular, that has always existed in a particular way, without the influence of, say, India, the Arab or Persian, you know, influence from all over the world, which is what has made our culture. And I think all countries have this. Certainly in the UK, I don't think the history of empire is taught in a significant way where people can understand what it means. You know, so it's kind of like a reckoning with the past. And I think the poem is written in the present, but it's speaking in many time zones. It's talking about the now, it is looking to the past, and it's also got an eye to the future. And that's the remarkable thing about the poem, is that it can hold all these time zones in it. It can move tremendous distances, and it's not a question of, oh, the poem is going to rewrite history, or it's not going to change any laws. I mean, poetry is going to do none of those things. We know that. But poetry is the space of, it's a space of dissent. It's a space of music. It's a space where of imagination. And I think for me in that poem, those letters written by those young men, many of whom never made it back home, fighting this war that they would not even be remembered for, because the countries that they came from quickly wanted to forget about it and gain independence. You know, like, I think, how do we then how do we honor that? How do we honor life? And how do we create a space where a voice can exist, and a voice can speak to us directly from the past? And for me, letters personally are one of my favorite literary forms. I'm reading actually at the moment the letters that Apollinaire wrote to his fiancée from the trenches of World War I. I mean, it's just, and I just think to have that as a record along with the poems such a rich archive. And now the way that we live, of course, we have such a digital footprint of so many things and so many communications. But that very private thing of sitting and writing a small letter and sending it off and keeping it and discovering the letter, you know, I mean, I discovered my parents' love letters when I was 14, and that's what made me write my novel, The Pleasure Seekers. It's sort of like letters hold architectures of the past. They hold stories, and you can make something from them. So I'm heartbroken that people don't write letters anymore, and that I don't think emails quite cut it in terms of the depth or the attention. And I feel like all that is going into a kind of, it's just going into the ether. And as a result, we are diminished. Our stories are diminished as a result. And, you know, how will the future, if there is one, decode our fears, our desires, our concerns? What will be left? For what will they take? How will they find those things? You know, maybe from poems. I don't know.
Thank you, Tishani. That was, yeah, wonderful. You've given me lots and lots to think about, and I'm sure the audience as well at home, lots to think about. And a poem existing in multiple time zones as well is such a wonderful idea, and how it can communicate the past, the present, the future. It has all this ability, I suppose, through, you know, the connections that you can make with images and things. And it's lovely to hear about the letters too. And I agree, letters need to make a comeback, and they are, you know, beautiful objects as well. It's the physicality sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe you might be willing to read a final poem or two for us, just to close the reading. But thank you for your wonderful answers to those questions, or more like think pieces, really. You know, as a reader and a fan of your book. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Thank you for your very thoughtful questions. I'll read two short poems. This is called Macroeconomics. One man sits on another if he can. One man's heart beats stronger. One man goes into the mines for another man to sparkle. One man dies so the family living at the top of the hill can eat sandwiches on the lawn. One man's piggy bank gets a bailout. One man tips over a stranger's vegetable cart. One man stays home and plays tombola till all this blows over. One man hits the road like a pilgrim to Shambhala, child on shoulders. One man asks, who's going to go out and buy the milk and eggs? One man's home is across the horizon. One man decides to walk there, even though it will take days and nights on tarmac with little food and water. One man is stopped for loitering and made to do squats for penance. One man reports fish are leaping out of the sea and sucking greedily from the air. One man eats his ration card. One man notices how starlings have taken to the skies like a toothache, a low continuous hunger searing across the fields. One man loads his gun. One man's in charge of the seesaw. One man wants to redistribute the plums. One man knows there's no such thing as a free lunch. One man finally sees the crevasse. One man gives his blanket to the man sitting in the crevasse. One man says there should be a tax for doing such a thing and takes it back. The ditch widens. And I'll end with the last poem in the book, which is called Survival. Dear ones who are still alive, I fear we may have overthought things. It is not always a war between celebration and lament. Now we know death is circuitous, not just a matter of hiding in the dark or under a bed, not even a slingshot for our loved ones to carry. It changes nothing. Ask me to build a wall and I will build it straight. When the end came, were you watching TV or picnicking in a field with friends? Was the tablecloth white? Did you say silent or fight? I hope by now you've given up the fur coat, the frequent flyer miles. In the hours of waiting, I heard a legend about a woman who was carried off by winds, a love ballet between her and the gods, which involved only minor mutilations. How I long to be a legend, to stand at the dock and stare at this or that creature who survived, examine its nest, marvel at a tusk that can rake the sea floor for food. Hope is a noose around my neck. I've traded my rollerblades for a quill. Here is the boat, the journey, the can. If we want to arrive, we must push someone off the side. It is impossible to feel benign. How many refugees does it take to build a mansion? I ask again, shall we wait or run? Here is winter, the dense packed ice. Touch it. It is a reminder of our devastation, a kind of worship, an incantation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tishani, for joining us this evening for this event. It's been a pleasure listening to your poems and speaking to you. I must remind everyone to go out and purchase a copy of A God at the Door, which is available everywhere, but you can get it on Bloodaxe's website direct, the publisher. Just before we finish, I'd just like to thank Peter Hebden for running the technical side of things this evening, to Melanie Birch at NCLA for helping with tickets and promotion, and to Vikas Kumar and GemArts for generously supporting this event as part of the GemArts Masala Festival. Don't forget to go to GemArts' website, which is gemarts.org, where you'll be able to find out more details about this year's program, and hopefully you can go to some other events. But for now, if you just please join me in a kind of virtual round of applause for Tishani, to thank her for a wonderful reading. And I hope you all have a very lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.